Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Professor Mary Joseph from Immaculate Conception University. Today we'll be talking about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and the Bloomsbury Group, two prominent cliques of intellectuals and artists in England from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. Both groups were quite controversial, and they revolutionized societal conceptions of what qualified as good art, or even art at all. In this lecture, I'll focus on how both groups interacted with religious norms in art and in society. Some questions we'll be exploring today are, in what ways did the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and the Bloomsbury Group make art which diverged from preceding religious art? How were these two groups similar and different from one another in their interactions with religious thought and religious art? First, let's talk a little bit of historical background. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood wanted to return to a style of art practiced in 15th century Italy, which was highly detailed, heavily saturated, and complex in composition. The art of Victorian England wasn't incredibly different from the art practiced at the height of the Renaissance, 300 years beforehand. Back in the good old days, rigid Victorian ideals enshrined a certain painting style: dramatic, heavily posed, exalting nobility and mythology, but ultimately stayed. The Pre-Raphaelites objected to classical poses such as the contrapposto, which ultimately glorified conformity to a particular style. To the PRB, conformity to Renaissance styles entailed artistic laziness rather than originality, which to them was more exacting and true to nature. The PRB mostly painted in a style characterized by truth to nature, as art critic and PRB defender John Ruskin said it. The Pre-Raphaelites eschewed the rigid imitation of a narrow style of art which the English Royal Academy of Arts and its founder Sir Joshua Reynolds approved of. English religious art of the Baroque period primarily consisted of chaotic, dramatic compositions of a dozen or more religious figures with solemn expressions and cherubs floating around, all lit with perfect celestial light. It's beautiful, but I suppose one can understand the PRB's opinion of art after the 15th century as being artificial. The PRB sought to depict religious figures as ordinary humans. Ridiculous, I know. In The Girlhood of Mary Virgin, we see Mary clothed in plain gray fabric, doing an ordinary household chore alongside her parents. They appear to be quite naturalistic, not posed in classical styles. Their faces are not contorted in spiritual rapture, but are quite ordinary, even plain. The public responded so negatively to the painting that Rossetti never again displayed his art in public. The art of members of the PRB was roundly criticized by contemporary art critics, who found the women of their paintings to be plain, including the Virgin Mary, and the ordinary mortal details of the human body in religious paintings, like Christ in the house of his parents, to be revolting. The Pre-Raphaelites' patron, John Ruskin, came to their defense, mildly, but publicly, saying in a letter to the Times that there is not one single error in perspective in 4 out of 5 pictures in question, and that as studies both of drapery and of every minor detail, there has been nothing in art so earnest or so complete as these pictures since the days of Albrecht Dürer. Members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood certainly weren't living by Victorian moral code. Rossetti himself most notably had an affair with Jane Morris, married to his friend William Morris. Some friend. Their art didn't conform to the Victorian moral code either. Rossetti's poem Jenny, which discusses prostitution, and whose narrator is clearly involved in the illicit activity, is a clear example of this. What's really interesting about the poem is that it doesn't completely villainize Jenny as a fallen woman, but asserts compassion for her. She is a victim of the urges of men who have created a corrupt system. Rossetti writes, "Shall no man hold his pride for warned, till in the the end, the day of days, at judgment, one of his own race, as frail and lost as you, shall rise, his daughter with his mother's eyes. He argues that anyone could become the victim of circumstance and be forced into prostitution, even the proudest man's daughter. It's odd that Rossetti has to use the "what if she were your daughter" rhetoric to elicit empathy, but his argument is pretty revolutionary, that sinful women deserve compassion, or even merit discussion within a poem. One scholar, Celia Marshak, contends that Rossetti's fears of private and perhaps government censorship lead to a self-censorship which radically changed the shape of the poem he published. This clearly demonstrates the radical nature of Rossetti's work and societal attitudes towards less than holy topics. Still, the works of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood managed to produce art quite different from Victorian religious norms. One passage from Jenny, which seems more discreetly heretical, follows. And the stilled features thus descried, as Jenny's long throat droops aside, the shadows where the cheeks are thin, and pure wide curve from ear to chin, with Raphael's or Da Vinci's hand, to show them two men's souls might stand, whole ages long, the whole world through, for preachings of what God can do. Rossetti compares the image of a prostitute to images of women within religious art, moreover, the art of the Renaissance, revered by the majority of his English peers and the Royal Academy of Arts. How can a prostitute look holy or like a perfect example of God's work, even a device to inspire religious awe? She appears a pure model of beauty. While the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood made revolutionary religious art, the Bloomsbury group made even more radical art and faced less public censure, though God knows they deserved it a lot more by contemporary standards. Dante Gabriel Rossetti himself and other members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood may have been rather debaucherous, but they didn't push things as far as the Bloomsbury group, focused on restoring a lost purity of past artwork instead of innovating. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood's art still focused a lot on the eternal, on heaven, on religious imagery. Symbolism was still incredibly important, where lilies denoted purity and roses meant passion. Though not always explicitly didactic, narrative was clearly important to the Brotherhood, using ekphrastic methods to give words to paintings and paintings to words. Their religious works were quite different from the preceding Baroque styles of religious art, but they were certainly more interested in religious work than the Bloomsbury group. The Bloomsbury group primarily produced superficially secular art. The art of the Bloomsbury group had a palpable ambivalence towards religious art, rarely depicting religious scenes. Many members were atheists, Father forgive them, and even rejected that art ought to have morality. Because there was a critical mass of artists exploring revolutionary styles like Impressionism in France and Italy, the Bloomsbury group didn't face as much criticism for their painting styles, even receiving commissions from churches. John Ruskin insisted that good art must have a moral purpose. Roger Fry and Clive Bell, on the other hand, rejected that notion entirely. They took the opposite opinion. Roger Fry felt that another standard than morality is applicable. We must therefore give up the attempt to judge the work of art by its reaction on life and consider it as an expression of emotions regarded as ends in themselves. Art must have the purpose of being purely art without seeking to create a reaction in life. This definition then excludes most, if not all, religious art. Somewhat ironically, Fry and Bell made many comparisons between the aesthetic emotion and religious rapture. Bell said that, "In my giddier moments, I have been tempted to believe that art might prove the world's salvation." Bell went further, saying that art is an expression of and a means to states of mind as holy as any that men are capable of experiencing. In a sense, the art of the Bloomsbury Group, and all good art by Fry and Bell's standards, was spiritual, though perhaps Bell would call that an incidental byproduct of purposefully ordered art. Most Bloomsbury art was concerned with different ends than the goals of religious art. In their private lives, members of the Bloomsbury Group engaged in verboten sexual activities. Many were queer and polyamorous, certainly practices rejected by the English religious establishment, and any good Christian. Virginia Woolf describes the countercultural beliefs of the group in the memoir Old Bloomsbury, saying, "All this had the result that the old sentimental views of marriage in which we were brought up were revolutionized. I should be sorry to tell you how old I was before I saw that there was nothing shocking in a man's having a mistress, or in a woman's being one." The Bloomsbury Group held very radical views of what a family should look like, rejecting the monogamous nuclear model for open marriages and children out of wedlock. Those poor children. But not many people approved of the bohemian lifestyle many members lived. After all, Mrs. Whitehead was scandalized. Beyond sexual practices, the group was generally idiosyncratic. They dressed themselves up as Gauguin paintings and wore dresses made with African textiles, fearing censorship, just like Dante Gabriel Rossetti. The Memoir Club, where Bloomsbury Group members divulged the sinful, juicy details of their lives, was top secret. The Bloomsbury Group did make some explicitly religious art. Duncan Grant painted a mural for the Lincoln Cathedral in Lincoln, England, in the 1950s. Far from being painted in the Baroque style of religious art, the mural simply depicts Jesus as a humble shepherd. Grant himself admitted that "I am very ignorant of the iconography of Christian art," and he was not religious himself. From 1960 to 1990, the chapel which held the mural was used as a storage room. Scholars have argued that the realism of the painting and the clear resemblance the figures held to Grant's close friends, including Vanessa Bell, made it unpopular with parishioners. To this day, Grant's frescoes are rarely mentioned in guidebooks or on the cathedral's website. Particularly, his depiction of Christ as a young, clean-shaven, muscular man likely offended Christian sensibilities. Evidently, even in 1950, even today, religious art has stagnated in its Baroque and classical trappings. Therefore, it's difficult to argue that the PRB or the Bloomsbury Group had a very strong impact on religious art. However, they both changed the meaning and purpose of art outside of churches and cathedrals, moving it from an expressly didactic and religious purpose to the purpose of eliciting the aesthetic emotion itself eventually with the Bloomsbury Group. Thank you and have a blessed day.